Chapter 9. Ajax or Boot. What must the king do now? Must he submit? The king shall do it. Shakespeare. King Richard II, 3.3, 143 to 144. In history, Ajax was a buffoon. In Sophocles' play, while under a spell, Ajax slaughters a whole flock of sheep, imagining them to be enemy warriors. Realizing his folly, he commits self-slaughter. In Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, Ajax is a man into whom nature hath so crowded humours that his valour is crushed into folly, his follies sauced with discretion. He is melancholy without cause, many hands and no use, all eyes and no sight. Strange as it may seem, Ajax was also the CIA's cryptonym for an intelligence operation intended to overthrow the Mossadegh government. The British chose a more appropriate name for their part of the same operation. They called it Boot. On the afternoon of June 23, 1953, 11 men, including Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, his brother Alan Dulles, and Kermit Kim Roosevelt, a CIA operative with some experience in the Middle East, gathered in Foster Dulles' roomy offices. It was raining outside, while inside the room there was the bubbly buoyancy of the Dulles brothers' optimism about U.S. power in the American century. On the agenda was a 22-page document initially proposed by the British and worked over in days of intense planning in Cyprus by American and British intelligence operatives. Alan Dulles summarized the goal of the meeting and the gist of the document. So that is how we get rid of that madman Mossadegh. There was little or no discussion of the morality of the operation. The dominant theme of the meeting was the possibility of Mossadegh's forming an alliance with the Tudeh party. Ambassador Loy Henderson chimed in, saying that while he did not like this kind of business, the madman would ally himself with the Russians. Finally, John Foster Dulles got up and brought the meeting to an end, saying, "Then let's get going." And thus began Operation Ajax. Until early August 1953, the Shah had resisted the idea of a coup against Mossadegh. Yet behind the scenes he had often worked, particularly with British officials, to weaken Mossadegh and to find a constitutional way to get rid of him. Even after Mossadegh ordered the British embassy closed in Iran, the State Department not only shared dispatches from the American embassy with the British government, but, more crucially, British intelligence succeeded in having its top man in Iran, Shapur reporter, hired by the U.S. Embassy as a consultant and accredited by Western magazines as a journalist. His regular trips to the court were easily camouflaged by the fact that he was tutoring the new queen in English. She spoke perfect German, had a fair command of French. Now M16's top man in Iran was helping her learn the language of Shakespeare. Moreover, during this period, Ernest Perron had regular contacts with Robin Zaehner, the British professor spy. Regardless of the overwhelming evidence that a series of events planned by the British-American Ajax operatives did take place in Tehran, there is still some ambiguity about what actually sealed Mossadegh's fate on August 19th. A CIA memorandum for President Dwight Eisenhower, written in the immediate aftermath of August 19th, says that an unexpected strong upsurge of popular and military reaction to Prime Minister Mossadegh's government has resulted, according to late dispatches from Tehran, in the virtual occupation of that city by forces proclaiming their loyalty to the Shah and to his appointed Prime Minister, Zahedi. But Mossadegh and his supporters have long rejected this claim, suggesting that the strong upsurge of support was paid for and procured by the CIA and British operatives. In the last 2 decades, Ardashir Zahedi has offered yet a third narrative, wherein the clumsy efforts of the CIA and the British worked in parallel with the efforts of his father, General Fazlollah Zahedi, and his supporters to resist Mossadegh. The two forces intersected occasionally, but were not identical. In fact, the support of thousands of patriotic Iranians and politicians like Ayatollah Kashani and Mozaffar Baghai, and not the Ajax operation, was in Ardashir's view the determining factor in his father's victory. For the last quarter century, the Shah's rule, his life, was to a considerable degree plagued by the question of what had happened in Tehran on August 19, 1953. Was it a coup or a counter-coup? A proud day of national resurrection, Guillaume-e-Meli, in support of an abused Shah, or a day of foreign infamy and intrigue against a democratic Mossadegh? Or are such attempts at certainty about labyrinthine realities of history the result of a proclivity for maniacism, the desire to see the world as an arena wherein forces of good and evil are in constant cosmic conflict? Before the 1979 revolution, throughout the Shah's 37 years on the throne, making him the 5th longest-serving monarch in the recorded history of monarchy in Iran, no set of events was more crucial than that of August 1953. The Shah and Mossadegh have both written with passion about what happened on those fateful days. Mossadegh's version declares that he was a strict constitutionalist whose only crime was challenging the colonial power of Britain. The Shah claims that Mossadegh was a demagogue, a sworn enemy of the Pahlavi dynasty, who used the issue of the nationalization of Iranian oil to seize despotic power and risked inadvertently turning the country over to the communists. There is no doubt that events of that August left an indelible mark on the Shah and the nature of his regime. There is also overwhelming evidence that the United States did in fact belatedly and at times begrudgingly join the British effort to overthrow Mossadegh. What is less clear is the precise role of these two countries' operatives in actually determining the outcome of the formative events of August 19th. An answer to this question can only be given when the whole episode is sufficiently historicized, viewed through Clio's cold, calculating, impartial eyes. The generation of Iranians who participated in or witnessed the events of those fateful days, as well as some of the American and British intelligence officers involved in Ajax, continue to see the day in epic terms, not as a simple moment of history, Moreover, many of the most important documents, archival material from the CIA, British M16, the Iranian military, the Tudeh Party, the Soviet intelligence and embassy in Tehran, the offices of the Shah, and Ayatollah Kashani and Borojerdi, to name only the most important, are still not available for scrutiny. Even if all these documents were declassified and made available for careful study, it might still be impossible to answer the question of whether it was better to go down in flames or defeat while insisting on the complete fulfillment of lofty ideals and principles, as Mossadegh claimed to have done, or to accept the best possible offer made by the West in terms of an oil agreement, as the Shah favored, and spare the country the gaping wound that was August 1953. At one point, Mossadegh told Vernon Walters, a member of the team of Americans negotiating with him, that he did not really want an oil agreement. Any agreement, he said, might taint his reputation with the Iranian people, as they would invariably assume foul play, even bribery. Returning to Iran empty-handed, Mossadegh said, "I return in a much better position." No less pertinent in the question of what would have happened in Iran had the events of August 19, 1953 not occurred. How long could Mossadegh have lasted in the face of the increasingly powerful Tudeh Party? Mossadegh's mystique and the Shah's constant harping against him created a romance of a democratic utopia that awaited Iran had the dark forces of the other not intervened and overthrown Mossadegh. A reminder of the power of this mystique came in the immediate aftermath of the 1979 revolution, when at the first chance the Iranian people had to commemorate. Mossadegh, more than 1 million of them converged on his estate a few kilometers outside Tehran and paid their tribute to an icon of their anti-colonial and democratic longings. For the Shah, August 1953 was both the cruelest and most triumphant month. After that August, Mossadegh became the Shah's lifelong nemesis. The Shah also became more successful in the effort to concentrate power in his office. He grew far more ambitious in his goals and more insistent on the need for his authoritarian leadership. Moreover, in spite of the Shah's assertion that he fully supported the nationalization efforts between 1951 and 1953, his actual views and his behind-the-scenes moves and stated preferences on the issue were more complicated. Though the Shah had personally only a marginal role in the events of that August 1953 day, he nevertheless considered it the beginning of his elected monarchy. "I knew they loved me," he told his wife. "Before I was merely a hereditary monarch, but today I really have been elected by my people." For the last 25 years of his rule, he ignored the tormented national psyche about events of that August day and insisted on having the nation celebrate it as a triumphant moment of national resurrection. Guillaume-E. Mossadegh and his supporters, on the other hand, have called August 19 a day of infamy, when a dastardly coup masterminded by the CIA and British intelligence overthrew his democratically elected nationalist government. In this narrative, a rented crowd and a motley crew of pimps and prostitutes, all bought and paid for by the CIA and M16, overthrew the government of Mossadegh. Advocates of the Mossadegh's narrative received a boost when in March 2000, U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright offered an apology for the U.S.'s role in the August events. She offered carefully worded regrets for the fact that the United States had played a significant role in orchestrating the overthrow of Iran's popular prime minister in 1953. Memoirs by CIA and British intelligence officers involved in planning or implementing Operation Ajax, as well as the leaked CIA official history of its role in the affair, have boosted the advocates of this theory. As some scholars have pointed out, even a careful reading of the CIA's self-laudatory official history raises as many questions as it answers. Ardeshir Zahedi, himself a key player in the events of those days, has been the most relentless critic of the secret history, often asking sardonically how a vodka-drinking American named Roosevelt, who spoke no Persian, along with a motley crew of paid agents, overthrew a popular government. In retrospect, there seems little doubt that while the Shah won the battle on August 19th, he might well have lost the war. Much anecdotal evidence indicates that in the collective memory of the nation after that August, the Shah never shook off the tainted reputation of being a puppet, a ruler forcefully restored to the throne by foreign powers. Martin Herz, a seasoned American diplomat working in Iran in the mid-60s, observed that even though by then the Shah and his regime had achieved impressive accomplishments in private, even regime stalwarts were unwilling to defend him. Mossadegh was a masterful politician and parliamentarian, as adept in bending the most arcane bylaws of parliamentary rule to his expedient political ends as he was at brushing the big strokes of symbolic politics. Everything about him, including his date of birth, has become a subject of contention. He was given to wild swings of emotion, easily going from melancholic stupor and tears to joyous exuberance and hyperactivity. Friend and foe concur he was deeply distrustful of others, his behavior sometimes bordering on paranoid. When traveling overseas for important negotiations, he kept sensitive documents in a briefcase he personally carried at all times. In the words of George McGee, the American Assistant Secretary of State, who spent approximately 80 hours of conversation with Mossadegh, and who was considered so sympathetic to the cause of Iranian nationalization that the British government tried to remove him from his post, Mossadegh was not only a patriotic Iranian nationalist, but was absolutely obdurate in his views, displayed a startling Mossadegh was not only a patriotic Iranian nationalist, but was absolutely obdurate in his views, displayed a startling naivety about economics and business in general, not just the oil business. McGee also emphasized that, in his view, the British too acted stubbornly and instead of negotiating in goodwill, preferred to wait for Mossadegh's expected fall. Much of the same image of Mossadegh is offered by Loy Henderson in several of his dispatches from Tehran. The British, of course, never tired of repeating that Mossadegh was a madman, a demagogue, and utterly unreliable as a negotiating partner. Their goal, from the outset, was to remove him. But Mossadegh was an intractable but powerful adversary for the Shah, and the British, as much a masterful thespian as a clever populist politician, Always aware of the mise en scene of his action, he feigned weakness and fragility when it served his purpose and resolute defiance when the occasion called for it. More than anything, he was also aware of his own iconic reputation, thus avoiding any decision that might jeopardize this stature. After the February confrontation between the Shah and Mossadegh, the relationship between the two deteriorated considerably. Mossadegh was then at the center of Iranian politics, domestic and international, economic and military, with the Shah playing at best a symbolic role. The retirement of many top generals in the military was ordered without even the knowledge, let alone the approval, of the Shah. The fact that the army had not come to Mossadegh's help in February 1953 had only increased his distrust of the military. He had created a commission and made General Mohammad Afshartis his most reliable ally in the army. Its secretary, it was this commission that forced the retirement of some 200 senior officers. From that February, there was essentially a race against time between Mossadegh and the Shah. The army was obviously the Shah's trump card. Could Mossadegh purge it before it could be used to remove him from power? The retirement of the officers part of Mossadegh's strategy to win this race. But a number of factors worked in favor of the Shah, further complicating the situation for Mossadegh and rendering it favorable to the Shah was the fact that Mossadegh refused every offer made by the British and American governments, and even from international organizations like the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, IRBD. With every refusal, he lost some part of his social base. When on February 20th, 1953, he decided to reject the final Anglo-American offer, he used what one Western observer called surprisingly intemperate language, decrying the plunder of Iran and advocating the eradication of all foreign influence. By then, the Eisenhower administration had given up its effort to find a negotiated resolution to the crisis. With every passing day, the Tudeh party became more assertive in its ambitions. In an effort to frighten the Americans, Mossadegh increased his public contacts with the Soviet government. As early as November 1952, the American embassy in Tehran was reporting that the spirit of extremism in the National Front was on the rise, and there was more and more evidence of Tudeh party influence in the cabinet. Mossadegh was said to be receiving a considerable amount of Tudeh-slanted advice, and several of his ministers and undersecretaries were not above suspicion as Tudeh tools. All of these developments were inadvertently benefiting the Shah and increasing the rift between Mossadegh and the clergy. The United States finally succumbed to the 2-year-old British campaign and decided to join the effort to topple Mossadegh in Operation Ajax/Boot. Even then, the Shah was hesitant to move. Some sources have suggested that for the Eisenhower administration, the die was cast on the first anniversary of July 21, 1952, when Mossadegh had been returned to power. On that day in 1953, his followers organized a demonstration in the morning while the Tudeh had a rally in the afternoon. New York Times journalist Kenneth Love was in Tehran at the time. In his words, the pro-Mossadegh forces, in quotes, mustered up a straggling assembly of a few thousand demonstrators, end quote, while the Tudeh, end quote, turned out a vibrantly disciplined throng of at least 100,000. End quote. At the end of the Mammoth Rally, a resolution was passed calling for, end quote, among other things, the liquidation of American spy nests. End quote. This was more than enough to convince the Eisenhower administration that the Shah and the British had been right and that Mossadegh would be no match for Tudeh party militancy. Eisenhower thus finally signed off on the plans developed in Cyprus for the overthrow of Mossadegh. The, quote, field commanders of the joint American-British operation to overthrow Mossadegh were American Kim Roosevelt and British intelligence officer named C.M. Woodhouse. In later years, some sources claim that Shapur reporter was the real master of British mischief. He claimed as much himself in the remarkable note he prepared on behalf of M16 for President-elect John F. Kennedy. He called himself the permanently accredited liaison officer of my service to his person. The Shah and claimed that he was, in fact, chief of Operation Boot. While reporter had then served in Tehran for many years, Roosevelt and Woodhouse were in comparison relative novices on Iran. Woodhouse had spent most of his time in places like Greece. Roosevelt had had his first experience in intelligence when he worked with Wild Bill Donovan during World War II. The world of cloaks and daggers, spies, and covert operations had for him the air of romance, part Hollywood, part Rudyard Kipling, with a pinch of James Bond. In his memoirs, with obvious relish, Roosevelt noted that for some he conjured Graham Greene's Quiet Americans. For security reasons, he had given everyone involved in the operation an alias. His was Rainmaker, while the Shah was called the Boy Scout. Aside from Roosevelt's tendency towards self-adulating exaggeration, evident in his memoir, when amongst other things he claims that he had picked Kim Philby as a double agent when he first saw him, in life he had a knack for turning his political connections to the Shah into substantial personal financial gain. In the 60s and 70s, he was, on the order of the Shah, one of the preferred middlemen in some of the big deals between the Iranian government and American corporations. Wheat purchases, for example, were in his monopoly. He was also reported to have acted as a middleman for Northrop's controversial sale of military hardware to Iran. Finally, even the time and the manner in which he chose to publish his memoir revealed his pragmatism. He waited until the Shah was in his political death throes. Until then, did he publish that he knew would be a bonanza to the Shah's critics, validating their claims about events in August 1953. But even then, he did not burn all his bridges. He asked, footnote, 27 years later, when Islamist students took over the American embassy, Khomeini incredibly referred to the American embassy as a den of spies. End of footnote. He asked Asadollah Alam, the court minister, whether His Majesty would object to the publication of his memoir. The tumultuous events leading to August 19 began early in the month as talk of Mossadegh's planned referendum to dissolve the Majlis became reality. He had by then also dissolved the Senate, using a legal technicality. For months he had been ruling with the special powers he had demanded and received from the Majlis. Amongst these rights was the power to make legislation. He even dissolved the equivalent of Iran's Supreme Court, retiring a large number of judges. The economic situation grew more dire by the day. The government was at the time even unable to make its payroll, and its efforts to print more money were blocked by Mossadegh's opponents in the Majlis. The government began to develop plans for an oil-less economy. Some have suggested that Mossadegh's initial impulse to dissolve the Majlis developed directly in response to his opponent's success in taking over the committee with oversight over money matters. Eisenhower's rejection of Mossadegh's latest request for financial aid made the economic horizon even more ominous. The referendum was simply the straw that broke the camel's back. For weeks the Shah had been under pressure from the American embassy and his court minister, Hussein Allah, to at least meet with General Zahedi, who had emerged as the clear candidate to replace Mossadegh. The Shah's reluctance to meet the general had several roots. Zahedi had been Minister of the Interior when a large number of National Front candidates were elected to the parliament. He had served in a Mossadegh cabinet, and finally he was a charismatic officer with a history of independence. The combination did not bode well for the Shah. As late as April 15, 1953, the Shah had taken definite position he would not take any steps to replace Mossadegh unless the parliament gave the prime minister a vote of no confidence. The Shah's hesitance to move against Mossadegh was at least partially rooted in his suspicion that the British government was responsible for much of the existing tension between himself and Mossadegh. He believed they were hoping to create a civil war so that they would have a pretext to divide Iran between themselves and the Russians. The Shah even refused to accept Allah's proposal to use the occasion of large demonstrations by the Tudeh party, coupled with a letter concern from Kashani, then still Speaker of the Majlis, to dismiss Mossadegh and appoint a Director of Public Secretary. The Shah even refused to accept Allah's proposal. One more time, wow. The Shah even refused to accept Allah's proposal to use the occasion of large demonstrations by the Tudeh party, coupled with a letter of concern from Kashani, then still Speaker of the Majlis, to dismiss Mossadegh and appoint a Director of Public Security to take over the government until the Majlis could give a vote of inclination to a new prime minister. But by early August, the Shah's attitude, as well as his options, began to shift. The sea change might well have begun on July 27th, when his twin sister, Ashraf, exiled earlier in the order of Mossadegh, traveled to Tehran incognito. She was there at the behest of the British and American governments, and had been sent to encourage the Shah to go along with the plans for an attempt to topple Mossadegh. Only hours after she conveyed the message, Mossadegh learned of her return. He angrily forced not only her speedy departure, but demanded and received a public statement from the Shah distancing himself from his sister's return to Iran. A few days after his twin sister's controversial trip, on August the 1st, the Shah met with U.S. General Norman Schwarzkopf Sr. The Shah had first met the general when he was an advisor to Iran's gendarmerie. He was now back in Iran to encouraged the Shah to join the plan against Mossadegh. If all of this was not enough, Kim Roosevelt made it clear to the Shah that plans to topple Mossadegh would go ahead even without his approval. Even in his August 3rd meeting with Roosevelt, the Shah still resisted the proposed operation by saying he was not an adventurer. But Roosevelt was stern in his warnings. Failure to act, he said, would turn Iran into another Korea and lead to the communist takeover of the country. At the same time, the Shah agreed to meet with General Zahedi, but with his son, Ardashir. Father and son were both in hiding in those days with a price on their heads. These meetings were conducted in great secrecy, with Ardashir entering the court through the back door, hidden in the trunk of a car. On August the 3rd, when Mossadegh held his controversial referendum in Tehran, the Shah told a confidant that great changes would take place shortly in the country. Meeting with Zahedi was preparation for these great changes. Not only were future plans discussed, but the Shah was also briefed on what the Zahedi camp was hearing from their secret allies within the Mossadegh government. These included the military governor of Tehran and the head of the police intelligence unit. The Shah's key meeting with General Zahedi took place on August 10th, when the referendum to dissolve the Majlis was also taking place in the rest of the country. No sooner had the referendum ended than Mossadegh sent a formal appeal to the Shah for a firman royal mandate to hold new elections. But instead of giving such an order, the Shah summoned General Zahedi to the court and informed him that he would shortly be appointed prime minister. In his own mind, the Shah could finally abide by his own rule not to take part in a coup against Mossadegh, but to remove him legally. With the dissolution of the Majlis, he believed he had the constitutional right to issue two firmans, one dismissing Mossadegh and the other appointing General Zahedi as his replacement. To give himself plausible deniability, or in other words, in order to put Mossadegh off, on August 11th, the day after the meeting with Zahedi, the Shah and his wife, along with a small entourage, went to his favorite summer resort, Kalardasht. The official announcement declared it to be the royal couple's routine summer vacation. The decision to go to Kalardasht, at least according to Roosevelt, was made in consultation with him, and only after he and the Shah had rejected Shiraz, Meshhed, Isfahan, and Tabriz as other possible destinations for the ostensible vacation. Each city was rejected for a different reason. Shiraz, for example, was deemed unfit because of its proximity to Qashqai tribes, in those days no friends of the Shah. At Kalardasht, the Shah apparently signed the two orders and asked Colonel Nematollah Nazari, the commander of the Imperial Guard, to deliver them to Zahedi and Mossadegh. Despite considerable controversy on whether and exactly when the Shah signed the orders, it remains incontestable that the Shah more than once affirmed in those days his intention to issue the two orders. For reasons that have never been fully explained, there was a 3-day delay before the letter of dismissal was delivered. Some attribute it to sheer incompetence, others to the fact that 2 of the 3 missed days were in fact Thursday and Friday, normal weekends in Iran, and some, like the Shah, suspected conspiracy. Whatever the cause, the delay allowed Mossadegh to learn of the plans. Interestingly, Nasiri delivered the Shah's letter of appointment to Zahedi on Friday, August the 14th. He immediately accepted and understood himself to be the country's constitutional prime minister. Until Mossadegh's letter was delivered the next day, there were 2 men who each claimed to be the lawful prime minister of the country. The letter dismissing Mossadegh was delivered the next evening around midnight. Mossadegh was waiting for the belated arrival of Nasiri after receiving signing the letter from the Shah. He had the messenger arrested. According to Adashar Zahidi, aside from the tardy delivery, Nasiri made another error by tarrying at the Prime Minister's home. He had not gone there to arrest Mossadegh, Zahidi says, so he could not have waited around. As these events were unfolding in Tehran, in Kalarj, why can't I say that word? It's spelled Kalardasht. Understand my dilemma? Okay. As these events were unfolding in Tehran, in Kalardasht, the Shah spent anxious days waiting. He was, in his wife's words, too nervous to even play cards. Their only link to the capital, Soraya says, was a private transmitter receiver which connected them to the headquarters of Colonel Nasiri. They drank coffee all day and spent often sleepless nights in nervous anticipation. On the night of the 15th, the Shah warned his wife to prepare for the possibility of a speedy departure. At any moment, he said, Mossadegh's supporters might attack the chalet, and we would have to leave without delay. A few hours later, the Shah's fears became reality. At 4 o'clock in the morning of August 16, he woke Soraya to tell her, Nasiri has been arrested by Mossadegh's supporters. We have to flee from here as soon as possible. As the Shah wrote in Mission for My Country, when Nasiri was arrested, all contact between him and the Shah ceased. But at 4 that morning, Nasiri's driver found his way to the 2-way transmitter and informed the Shah what had transpired. The Shah was traumatized, believing that the entire operation had failed and that his life and his throne were now in jeopardy. Without telling their guest, he and his wife, along with an aide, Abolfath Atabi, and a pilot, Mohammed Khatam, took a small 4-seat plane to Ramsar, where the Shah's twin-engine Beechcraft awaited them in the royal hangar. They speedily boarded, worried that guards loyal to Mossadegh might arrive at any moment. Only when they had boarded did Soraya remember that she had left her dog behind, a Skye Terrier she adored. But there was no question of retrieving the dog now. The Shah reassured his distressed wife that the servants and the friends they had left behind at the chalet would take care of the dog. The Shah piloted the plane. Before long, their small aircraft approached the control tower in Baghdad. The Shah thought it unsafe to identify himself. Instead, he told Baghdad Tower that he was the pilot of a plane of tourists, that they had developed engine trouble and needed permission to land. After some confusion and delay, the Shah's plane was allowed to land. Fortuitously, King Faisal, the Iraqi monarch, was returning from a trip, and his plane landed at the airport shortly after the Shah's. The plume-plucked Shah waited for about half an hour in the 104-degree heat before King Faisal learned of his arrival and decided to grant him and his entourage asylum. On the other hand, the Iranian ambassador, Mozaffar Alam, refused to meet with the Shah, and on instructions from the Mossadegh government, tried to have the royal couple arrested. The Iranian Foreign Ministry had sent a directive to its embassies around the world that the Shah no longer held a position of authority in Iran. News of the Shah's flight created quite a stir in Tehran. The many papers belonging to the Tudeh party and its numerous front organizations began to attack the Shah, the monarchy, and U.S. influence, calling for the immediate establishment of a republic. Kenneth Love, the American journalist in Tehran, reported that in one Tudeh party rally, angry demonstrators shouting anti-American slogans attacked him, and only the kind of protection of a wiser member of the party saved him from the wrath of the roused crowd. The Tudeh party's use of such concepts as people's democracy and a united front conjured the fate of Eastern European democracies that had then all fallen into the hands of the communists. Members of the Iranian middle class, merchants of the bazaars called bazaris, and industrialists were all particularly wary of the Tudeh party's increasingly militant and assertive discourse. Certainly the efforts of the British agents and the CIA's own operations, like using agents provocateurs, and publishing anti-communist articles and books, worked to augment these fears and anxieties. At the same time, the new swagger in the demeanor of the Tudeh party leadership was probably in itself enough to foment these middle-class fears. Even more controversial than the Tudeh party reaction was what appeared on the pages of Bakhtar, the paper founded and edited by Hossein Fatemi. Even during his tenure as foreign minister and spokesperson for the government, Fatemi continued to edit the paper. Beginning on August 16th, the paper published increasingly incendiary reports about the Shah's departure. The most critical were written by Fatemi himself. One of Fatemi's articles was titled, "The Traitor Who Wanted to Shed the Nation's Blood Fled." In it, Fatemi wrote, "Go, you traitor, because even the foreigners now find you so worthless and useless that they will not pay you any wages for your most recent criminal act. You must now pay your bills in European cabarets from the dollars and pounds you and your father have plundered. Go, you traitor, who completed the 30-year history of the Pahlavi's dynasty criminal record." The language of these editorials was particularly remarkable for a paper edited by a member of the cabinet that still claimed allegiance to the Constitution. The underlying assumption of the articles was the idea that the end of the monarchy and the Pahlavi dynasty was a cherished and foregone conclusion. Yet, as the spokesperson for the Mossadegh government, the same Fatemi declared that the cabinet did not plan regime change. In Bakhtar's rendition of what happened on August 15th, and in the government's official announcement broadcast at 7 in the morning on August 16th, there was no mention of the Shah's firman dismissing Mossadegh. There are some reports that Mossadegh initially planned to broadcast a radio message to the nation, informing them that he had been dismissed by the Shah. But Fatemi and other more radical members of the National Front changed his mind. Instead, the official broadcast only said that a military coup against the government had been successfully thwarted. Fatemi's editorial only referred to Nasri's coming to the Prime Minister's home for confidential business and giving a letter, and said that the Prime Minister wrote the time and date of the letter's receipt on his back. Yet another interesting aspect of the Fatemi editorial was that it refers to the coup attempt as solely the work of Britain, with no mention of the United States. It is a remarkable fact of historical transubstantiation that even the events of August became known as the CIA coup, with all but no mention of the British role in the affair. By the evening of August 18, all seemed lost for the Shah. Both the CIA and the British and American governments had concluded that the attempt to overthrow Mossadegh had failed. Concurrent with the CIA's report to Eisenhower on August 18 about the failure of, quote, the move, some in the small coterie of aides working with General Zahedi had arrived at the same conclusion. They decided that they should declare the creation of a free Iran and send personal emissaries to the 3 units of the military that were still loyal to the Shah and were stationed in the provinces. One in Rasht, led by Colonel Gurani; the second, a cavalry unit commanded by Colonel Bakhtiyar in Kermanshah; and the third in Isfahan, commanded by Colonel Zarghami, and asked them to move toward Tehran and, if necessary, overthrow Mossadegh through what was beginning to look like a civil war. The CIA's memo for President Eisenhower claims that the failure to topple Mossadegh was caused by 3 days of delay and vacillation by the Iranian generals concerned. The memo goes on to say that the United States should now, quote, take a whole new look at the Iranian situation and probably have to snuggle up to Mossadegh if we are going to save anything there, end of quote. Maybe as a part of this, quote, snuggling up, on the evening of August 18th, Henderson returned to Tehran. He had left Iran earlier to give the United States plausible deniability about its role in the August events. His return was so urgent that he traveled in a special United States Air Force plane. He was met at the airport by Mossadegh's son and taken directly to meet the Prime Minister. Mossadegh appeared to be in a jubilant mood, speaking with a sarcastic smile, although exhibiting an underlying smoldering sense of resentment. He was fully dressed and not in his usual pajamas. Henderson began by complaining about attacks on U.S. citizens. It is not clear whether he was, as Roosevelt claims, trying to ensure that Mossadegh supporters would be off the street the next day, thus facilitating a last-ditch effort to overthrow the government, or whether he was Henderson began by complaining about attacks on U.S. citizens. It is not clear whether he was, as Roosevelt claims, trying to ensure that Mossadegh supporters would be off the street the next day, thus facilitating a last-ditch effort to overthrow the government, or whether he was truly resigned to Mossadegh's victory, accepted the failure of the move, and was simply trying to protect the lives of American citizens. The incredible fact that the CIA claims that it lost all the relevant files about the August events in Iran, thus avoiding congressional mandates to declassify and release them, and the fact that no Iranian record of the meeting has survived, has made the work of understanding Henderson's motives and Mossadegh's intentions more difficult. Finally, Soviet and Tudeh Party archives, still not made available for scrutiny, could shed light on the party's remarkable passivity on August 19th. Was it, as some scholars have suggested, the result of the Soviet Union's post-Stalin realization that it had fallen strategically behind the United States in the arms race? To Henderson's complaints about reports of attacks on American citizens, Mossadegh replied that Iran was, in his words, in the throes of a revolution, and people thought that the United States was in disagreement with them. Henderson was coyly tough, responding that if the people of Iran did not want the Americans, they were ready to leave en masse. Mossadegh was quick to respond that the Iranian government did not want Americans to leave. Henderson then asked Mossadegh to tell him confidentially just what had happened during recent days. Mossadegh first outlined his reasons for dissolving what he called a British purchase Majlis. Mossadegh then surprised Henderson by asking him if he had any comments to make regarding his dissolution of the Majlis. Henderson had none. Mossadegh's arguments, as he must have known, were hard to fathom for several reasons. With commendable clarity and honesty, Interior Minister Gholam Hussein's Siddiqui had told Mossadegh that you have made your name as a parliamentarian, and that these current Majlis elections were held during your tenure. He reminded Mossadegh of the long, albeit unhappy, history of recess appointments in 20th century Iran. He reminded Mossadegh that in the first 13 years, 5 months and 2 days of a constitutional monarchy, there was no parliament in session for 10 years and 2 months and 28 days, and thus the Shah had made the necessary recess appointments. He asked Mossadegh, what guarantee is there that the Shah will not choose another prime minister after you dissolve the Majlis? Mossadegh replied that the Shah does not have the guts to do that. The Shah had developed the guts, and Mossadegh's referendum had been decisive in that development. Henderson refused to make any direct comment about the dissolution of the Majlis. He wanted to know about the events of recent days and specifically about the effort of General Zahedi to replace Mossadegh. Mossadegh said, on the evening of the 15th, Colonel Nasseri had approached his house, apparently to arrest him. Colonel Nasseri himself, however, had been arrested. He had taken oath not to try to oust Shah, and would have lived up to his oath if the Shah had not engaged in venture of this kind. Henderson then asked whether it was in fact true that the Shah had issued a firman removing him as Prime Minister and appointing Zahedi in his place. Mossadegh denied having seen such a firman, and went on to say that even if he had, it would have made no difference. His position for some time had been that the Shah's powers were only ceremonial in character. Henderson knew this was the crux of the matter. "I am particularly interested in this point," he said, and then asked, "Was I to understand he had no official knowledge that the Shah had issued a firman removing him as Prime Minister, and b. even if he should find that Shah issued such a firman in present circumstances, he would consider it to be invalid?" Mossadegh's reply was clear and categorically. "Precisely." In his memoir, too, Mossadegh reports at greater length his view that Shah did not have the authority to dismiss him. He writes that the dismissal order was not only against the Constitution, but there was no reason for it. "My government had never done anything against the interest of the country of His Majesty." But as he himself had confirmed in an earlier letter to the Shah, when he had other National Front leaders organized a sit-in at the court, and as many of his advisers had warned him before he decided to dissolve the Parliament, there was ample evidence that the Shah had the power of making recess appointments. One concrete consequence of Mossadegh's discussions with Henderson was the Prime Minister's decision to ban all demonstrations on August 19th, and to ask his supporters, including members of the Tudeh party, to stay off the streets on that day. Kenneth Love seemed to offer another reason for the order when he proclaimed that he had in fact witnessed the first resurgence of royalist sentiments in the evening of August 18th. During much of that day, Tehran was the scene of bloody street battles between Tudeh party activists who had gone on an offensive ransacking the headquarters of right-wing parties. The Pan, Iranist, and Sumka parties were the two, as well as some Iranian memoirs have reported that the Shah had offered financial and political support to these two parties. That support was now paying off. If in the morning royalist demonstrations seemed small, by even the tide began to turn. Soldiers dispatched to stop the fighting between the right and the left wing activists began to club both factions impartially while shouting, "Long live the Shah!"